We're now on Daf Lamed Zayin Amid Beis, and again we're in this digression in which we're analyzing the Shita of Rabbi Yossi Haglili and the Bailus of the Kohen, or shall we say the ownership of the Kohen over the Bechor. Limin al Bechor Balmum Shenitan LeKohen Shalom Atzinu Lo Kol HaTarku. The Gemara adds like a feeling of amazement, like a statement of wow, where do we find such a thing? We never found any case where in the entire constellation of Kodshim that the animal is given over to the Kohen and it's a balmum and it cannot be brought on the Mizbeach, but you give it over to the Kohanim and the Kohanim own it. We never found such a thing. But that's what we derive from this pasuk of Lecha. Right? We'll read the pasuk once more, and the pasuk says, Ubisaram Yelecha. Yelach. Rabbi Yishmael Dafkale, how does he know that in the case of a Bechar Balmum, that the Kohanim are the owners of the korban, they'll eat the meat? And the answer is Milacha Yeh de Seifa. Fine. So Gemara now goes back to the Iker Machlokas between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Bishlei Mila Rabbi Yossi Haglili, Debuki Le Nami Maser U Pesach. So the pasuk of damam and chelbam in the plural is coming to include all three karbanos, bechar, maser, pesach, hainu dichsiv. Now I understand when the Torah says lo tifta, kodesh hem, it means that hem krevim v'ein tmurasam kreva. That a unique halacha that applies to these three karbanos and only these three karbanos, that's Bechar, Maser, and Pesach, is that if you do a Maisa Tmura to be Memir, the karban, onto another animal which was Chulin, that animal does not become Tmura. And that's what the Pasuk means, Lo Tifta Ki Kodesh Hen. And all that is according to Rabbi Yossi Haglili, who learns this pasuk is referring to all three karbanos. Not only to Bechar, but also to Maser and Pesach. Utnan, and now the Mishnah makes sense, and this Mishnah is in Masechta Tmura, that Tmuras Bechar u Maser Hein uvladon uvlad vladom ad sof kol olam harei hein kibechar umaser ve'achlu b'mumam lebailim. So what happens in a case where a person does a tmura to a bechar and a maser? It doesn't have the same identical status as the original bechar and maser. The replacement tmura, and the same halacha, by the way, will apply to the vlad if the bechar or the maser animal gives birth. Then ye'achlu b'muman lebailim. What does it mean? Since the tmura of bechar and maser cannot be brought on the mizbeach, and that's the exception to the rule of tmura, therefore, we're going to let the animal go out and graze until it becomes a balas mum and swallows a nail or a screw. And then what we do is we can eat it through pigeon. We're going to be poded, and the owner of the animal can eat the basar. Usnan. Now we have another Mishnah, which is in Psachim on the on Tzadi Vav, that means towards the end of Psachim, it says there, with regard to Pesach, because so far we've been talking only about Tmura or Vlad of Maser and Bechor. What about Pesach? Omer Rabbi Yoshua, Shamati sheTmuras Pesach kreva, uTmuras Pesach ena kreva. I have two different traditions that contradict each other, and what's the status of a Tmura of a Pesach? And the question is this before Yudalid or after Yudalid? The Ainli Lefarish, I don't know under what circumstances the halacha is that Tmuras Pesach ain't a kreva, under what circumstances kreva. So we're trying to figure out this statement of Rabbi Yeshua that in one tradition he heard that Tmuras Pesach ain't a kreva. If we accept Rabbi Yossi Aglili, then we automatically apply this halacha that we saw in Bechar and Masa, that there's no hakrava on Tmuras Bechar and Masa, we automatically apply it to Korban Pesach. So therefore, since the pasuk is referring to all three karbanos, one of the three is Pesach, then certainly Tmuras Pesach, like Tmuras Bechor and Maser, is Eino Kreva. Elo Rabbi Shmuel. But if I go like Rabbi Shmuel, who says that the parsha here is dealing exclusively with what? With Bechor, and the plural of Domam and Chelbam is referred to three types of Bechor, three different species of animals, is the Mukilei Kula B'Bechor, is Maser Pesach Lo Kreva Tmoros Minolim. What is the source from which Rabbi Yishmael would derive the conclusion that in the case of a Tmura of either a Maser or a Pesach, as far as Bechor is concerned, it's fine, because the parsha is talking about Bechor. But there's no mention in the parsha neither of Pesach nor of Maser. So how do we know that, according to Rabbi Yishmael, how do we know that Maser and Pesach are excluded from the halacha of Tmuraso Kodesh Lahakriv Al Gabi Mizbeach? Gemara says, Maser Gomer Avora Mibechor. We have an automatic equation or analogy between Bechor and Maser, and that's based on a Gzera Shava called Avra. So let's just read the psukim. In Vayikra Chav Zayin, it says, Kol asher yavor tachas hashevet asiri kodesh. So we have the word yavor with regard to Bechor, and with regard to, what I meant to say is with regard to Maser, I said Bechor, but with regard to Bechor, it also says, Vavarta kol peter rechem lashem. So the word Avar appears in both psukim to give us an open equation, Gzera Shava, between Maser and Bechor. And Pesach, Behejer Kosev Be Kesev. Matamaloma Im Kesev. Why is the extra word Im Kesev in the pasuk? L'Rabos Tmuras HaPesach HaPesach Shetikar Shlomim. Wow. Now we have a case of Tmuras Pesach, and you will subject the Karman to Hakrova. Why? Because he did the Tmura after Pesach. Now, we had a long discussion, remember when we started Maseches Zevachim, that Pesach Liachar Zmano is Shlomim. And therefore, the status of Tmuras Pesach is like the status of Tmuras Shlomim. And just like Tmuras Shlomim is Karev Al Gabi Mizbeach, so too Tmuras Pesach is Karev Al Gabi Mizbeach. And therefore, we already have an answer now to Rabbi Yeshua's perplexing question. How could he have heard two things? Tmuras HaPesach Eino Kreva and Tmuras HaPesach Kreva. The answer is, if it's Tmuras HaPesach after Yudalid ben Nisan, then it's Karev. Why? Because the Pesach after Yudalid ben Nisan automatically becomes a Shlomim, and it's Tmuras Shlomim, which is Karev HaGav Mizbeach. Rabbi Yeshua heard a different tradition that Tmuras Pesach Eino Kreva, Yachal Af Lifnei HaPesach Kei Tamid Lomar, who. So the extra word who is a miyut to tell me that if before Pesach he takes a behemoth chulin and he says harezu tmura of this korban Pesach, then such a tmura is not brought on the mizbeach. Okay, now we already finished with Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Yossi Galili. Let's go back to the original brisa number 1 that derives from Dam Shvochecha Yishofech, the conclusion that one matana is critical. But we have all those tanoim that derived other things from this pasuk, right? We had one tana who derives that the shirayim should be poured onto the yisod hamizbeach. We had a tana who derived that if instead of throwing, he poured it, he was yotze. Or Rabbi Shmuel, who derives from this pasuk that the dam of Maser and Pesach requires matan domim and matan imurim, is high kol and itonim al mizbeach hachitzon shenasonim maton achas shekiper minolan. Now we go back to square one, to first scratch. and we ask ourselves, is there another possible source from which we derive the conclusion that in all korbanos, one matana is critical? And the answer is Savri Lekabeis Hillel, the Amri Af Chatos Shedasana Matana Achas Kiper, the Alfin and Kula Mechatos. In the case of Chatos, the Torah says explicitly that one matana is sufficient, and Beis Hill understands that that case of Chatos is a binyan av, and it's a basis that we can expand to all korbanos. Meaning, just like in Chatos, one nesina is sufficient, and b'di'eved Chatos is kosher, even and it's mechaper, even if he only did one nesina. So too in all korbanos, one nesina is sufficient. You wonder why Brisa number 1 wasn't smart enough, so to speak, to derive that conclusion from Chatos. Now again, we haven't gotten to the sugya later on, which is going to raise the question according to Beis Hill, how do we know that in the case of Chatos, one single nesina is sufficient to be generate kaparas hakarbon? But in any event, once we get to that, we'll understand that the sugya that we're doing now, that case of Chatos becomes a binyan av for all other korbanos. Now, in regard to Beit Shammai was the one who was cholek on Beis Hillel in regard to a Chatos, v'chatos shtei matonos. According to Beis Hillel, according to Beit Shammai, the minimum requirement in a case of a Chatos is 2 matonos. Amar Rav Huna, what's the basis for Beit Shammai's conclusion? My time in the Beit Shammai. Oh, so now, okay, good. Baruch Hashem, we're still within our time allotment. Because now we're going to get to a sugya which is called Yesh Aim LeMikra, Yesh Aim LeMesoris, which means that sometimes there's what's the word I want to use? A discrepancy. Sometimes there's a discrepancy between the letters of the word in the Torah and the way we read the word. For example, Amar Rav Huna, my time in the Beit Shammai, karnos. With regard to the corners of the Mizbeach, the Torah repeats itself 3 times, each time in the plural, which means 2, because the minimum of plural is 2. 2, 2, and 2 is 6. Harei kan sheish. Now, there are only 4 corners to the Mizbeach. You can't add a 5th or a 6th. So how could the Torah be telling me that Kronos means that on 6 corners of the Mizbech there should be a Zrikas Hadam, das Kenit Zayin? And therefore we're going to have to divide it up in a way where the Torah is repeating another 2 Kronos. Now, if the Torah is repeating another 2 Kronos, then we apply the principle, which is across the board in Kodshim, that if the Torah repeats itself, then it's to tell you it's likuva. And it's absolutely critical. So we're going to divide up the 6 into 2 sections, 4 and 2. And the reason for that is because there's going to be one pasuk where the tradition of the written word is chronos with a vav, which is called molek. The tradition with regard to the other chronos is chaser, without a vav. So therefore, we're going to take the 2 chronos without a vav, and chronos is in plural. We're going to now derive 4 chronos, and that's called lemitzvah, because again, 1 matan damim b'di'eved is critical and sufficient. And now we have the word chronos with a vav. And the repetition of chronos, after we already have 4 chronos, is to tell you, according to Beit Shammai, that there's another 2 chronos. What do you mean another 2 chronos? There are only 4. We already covered the 4, but the answer is the repetition of 2 chronos is to teach me that's li'akev, and therefore we have to have at least a minimum of 2 chronos li'ikuva in order to validate the carbon. and the other two kronos is only lemitzvah. And therefore, arba lemitzvah shtayim li'akev. So the Torah says repeats the requirement of applying the dam to 2 out of the 4 kronos to teach me shona olav hakosav li'akev, and therefore the 2 kronos are absolutely critical. That is the shita of Beit Shammai. But now we're stuck with Beis Hillel, because Beis Hillel claim that all you need, even in the case of chatos, where it says kronos, 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 only 1 corner and 1 zrika is critical. Beis Hillel. So Gemara says, karnas, karnas, kronos. Right? There are 3 times where these 4 letters appear, but in one of those 3, an extra vav to make it mole appears. So you have karnas, which is choser without a vav. You have another time it says karnas without a vav. And again, if we had time, we'd go through the psukim in the Chumash inside, but we don't have time for that. And karnos, in the 3rd occasion, it adds the vav, which means it's mole. Says Beis Hillel, harekan arba. Why is it arba? Because according to Beis Hillel, when the vav is left out, you read it as a singular, karnas, the horn of, or the corner of. So it's only 1 corner. Now you have another karnas, adding a 2nd corner. Now you have karnos with a vav, which is clearly plural, and that adds another 2 corners. Hare kan arba. So the total number is not 6, as Beis Shammai would insist, but rather 4, according to Beis Hillel. Now, what does it mean that there are 4? Well, guess what? Out of those 4, only 1 is repeated, and therefore it's sholosh lemitzvah v'achas le'akev. Now, wait a second. How does Beis Hillel know that 1 is repeated? You have karnas, karnas, that's 1 and 1 is 2, and you have karnos, which is 2. Where's the repetition? So the Gemara immediately attacks. Ema kula mitzvah. Maybe this whole requirement of 4 kronos is lemitzvah. That's what should be done. But b'di'eved, the carbon is machaper without any matana whatsoever. Very strange havami. The Gemara immediately rejects the kapara b'chdi lo ashkan. We don't find in the constellation of Kodshim any carbon that's machaper without any zrika whatsoever. Zrika is always critical. So therefore, when the Torah gives us 4 kronos, we're going to have to assume that really 4 kronos is lemitzvah, but that can't be, because there's no such thing as a carbon that's machaper without a zrika. So therefore, we're going to say that 3 out of the 4 are lemitzvah, and 1 is likuva. It's absolutely required. Ibay Sema, another possible understanding of Beis Hillel is Hainu time of Beis Hillel, ahani mikra v'ahani mesoris. Now, according to this second lishna in Beis Hillel accepts both what we call yesh aim lemikra and yesh aim lemesoris. In other words, we have to justify both the mikra, meaning the way it's actually written, and the mesoris, the way we, by tradition, understand how to read it. And this is a machlokas about how to expound a word where the written is different from the way we pronounce it. And, for example, sometimes a letter is left out in the way it's written, but yet we know to read it based on tradition. We know to read it with that letter. So if we hold yesh aim l'masores, then we have to expound the word not based on the word, the way it's written, because it's written, let's say, without a vav, for example, but the way we know it should be written, it should be pronounced. That's called yesh aim l'masores. Yesh aim l'mikra means that we interpret the word based on the way it is written in the Torah. That's called yesh aim l'mikra. All this is a sugya in Masechta Makos on Daf Zayin. So let's see how Beis Hillel uses both yesh aim lemikra and yesh aim lemisoros. It comes up with a contradiction to the two, between the two, and a compromise. Ahani mikra l'tfuye chada. Right? The mikra itself is going to add one, and ahani misores, but the misores is lebetzuri chad is going to subtract one. Well, let's just see how that works. He says the pronounced form contains allusions to 6 applicants, right? Because we said that we pronounce it chronos, and that repeats itself 3 times in the Torah, which means 2, 2, and 2 is 6, and that was yesh aim lemesoris. But now Beis Hillel are going to use yesh aim lemikra as well. And therefore, since there's a contradiction here between either 4 or 6, the Torah's true intent is to come up with some sort of a number that's midway between those two numbers of yesh aim lemikra, yesh aim lemesores. And that's going to arrive at the conclusion that there should be 5 matanos. Now, there can't be 5 matanos and only 4 corners of the Mizbeach. The answer is 4 are a mitzvah, and the 5th is a repetition, Shina Kosev Le'akev, to tell you that 5th matana, which is a repetition of one of the other 4, is Likuva, hence Beis Hillel derives the conclusion that one. Now, the Gemara is going to apply this logic in Beis Hillel straight across the board. In other words, whenever we're going to have yesh aim lemikra contradicting yesh aim lemesores, then we're going to have to come up to the conclusion that according to Beis Hillel, we have to find a compromise between the two. Elamiyata, and if that be the case, l'totafos, l'totafos, l'totafos. 3 times the Torah says, with regard to the tefillin shel rosh, totafos, which is in the plural. However, one time it's written l'totafos with a vav, the other 2 times it's written chaser, and therefore, l'totafes without a vav is 1, l'totafes without a vav is another one, l'totafos with a vav is 2, harei kan arba. But now we're going to apply the principle of ahani krov, ahani mesoris, that according to Beis Hillel we use both. And that being the case, then we're going to read l'totafas as if it said l'totafos, because that's the Masorah of how to read the word. And therefore you have l'totafos in effect 3 times, if you hold yesh aim lemesores. And therefore you have 2, 2, and 2 is 6. But if you hold yesh aim lemikra, we only have 1, 1, and 2, right? Because twice it says l'totafes without a vav. And therefore we end up with 4. Now, if we end up with 4, and that's based on the yesh aim lemikra, now we go back to yesh aim lemesores is 6, then we have to come up with 5. Is chamisha bati moi boile mevad? Do we put 5 different batim in the shel rosh? And the Gemara answers, Savalak Rabbi Akiva di Omar. Oh, Rabbi Akiva has a different interpretation of totafos, in which he understands that totafos is a combination of 2 words that are put together. It's a hybrid of tat and pas. And these 2 words have a meaning. Each one means 2 in a different language. Tat bekatvi, in a country called Katvi, which he translates as Kaspi. I have no idea where that is. I knew a person whose name was Kaspi, but I don't know where Kaspi is on the face of the globe. Anyway, the word tat or tot in Kaspi language is 2. And pos is also 2, be Afriki, in Africa. That's where the word pos means 2. So if that be the case, then according to Rabbi Akiva, by definition, l'totafos, 2 plus 2 means 4. So there are 4 batim in the shel rosh. So Gemara asks Elamiyata, but what do we do in the case of yesh aim lemikra, yesh aim lemesoris in sukkah, meaning how many defanos, how many walls does the sukkah have? On the one hand, it says basukos, without a vav. And again, it says basukos without a vav. And then the third time, it says basukos with a vav. Now, if you go with yesh aim lemesoris, we're going to read basukos without a vav as if there was a vav. And if there was a vav, then you have 2, 2, and 2, which equals 6. So ahani mikra v'ahani mesores. As therefore, if you hold mesores, then you have 2, 2, and 2, because as if there was a vav in both cases where it left out a vav, because that's how you read it, and that's the tradition. Is 2, 2, and 2 is 6, which means you'd have to make a sukkah out of 6 defanos. But on the other hand, if you hold yesh aim lemikra, we've got 1, 1, and 2, which is a total of 4. And according to Beis Hillel, we have to compromise between yesh aim lemesor, yesh aim lemikra, and come up with 5. Is there chabisha defanos boilim evan? Are we going to require, therefore, 5 walls to a sukkah? Let's just begin Maseches for the 2 minutes that we have left. And the Gemara answers, Hasam dal chad legufe. You can't use one of the 3 to derive how many defanos, because one time, the Torah at least one time has to call it a sukkah. And you're left with, therefore, 2. However, chad l'svacha, I need another time it says sukkahs to teach me not only that you need a hut, but also you need a schach on top of the hut. Is memela, what are you left with? You're left with only 1 sukkahs. If that be the case, then all you need is 2 defanos. But asay hilchas v'grati l'shlisha kimnab tefach. But we have halacha Moshe Sinai that came to tell you that the 3rd wall has to be just a tefach. Okay, just 1 second. I missed 1 point over here. Here's the point that I missed. Since according to Beis Hillel, we compromise between yesh aim lemikra and yesh aim lemesores, and yesh aim lemesores came up with 6, yesh aim lemikra came up with 4, so therefore we require 5. We're going to subtract 2 out of the 5. Why do we subtract 2 out of the 5? Because one teaches me the sukkah, and the other teaches me the schach. Memela, what we're left with is 3. So should we require 3 walls for a sukkah, 3 full defanos? On that, we have a halacha Moshe Sinai that the 3rd dofen doesn't have to be a full-fledged dofen with, asar tvachim and so forth and so on, but rather 1 tefach is enough. And in Mirz Shem and tomorrow's daf, we're going to go weiter, and again, we're going to try to show in the parsha of Tumas Leda that likewise we have a contradiction between yesh aim lemikra and yesh aim lemesaros. The truth is that, if you had an extra minute, we could mamish just finish up the sugya. Elamei ato v'toma shvuayim, v'toma shvuayim, shivim, and shivim. Now take a look. Twice it says the word shvuayim, and once it says shivim. So shvuayim would actually mean 14, and these are the days of Tara for a woman who gave birth to a nekeva. And then once it says shivim, and it's not shvuayim, so shivim means 70 days. So if we're going to apply the principle of ahani kra and ahani mesores, then we're going to take 14, and we're going to take 70. Okay, I need your help here, Steve. And right down the middle, it's our boim who trained by Elamesav. Right, we're left with 42. Let me just get that right. 14 minus 70 is how much is 66? Did I get that right? 66 and 14 is 70. No. 56. What am I talking about? Right, 56. Now, if I divide 56 into 2 parts, what do I get? Help me out over here. I get
28.
28. So if I add 28 to 14, what do I end up with? 42?
42.
Excellent, 42. So now we're going to come to the ridiculous conclusion that she has 42 days. That's not so. And the Gemara answers, Shani Hasam Tsiv Kinidasa. And Kinidasa is telling me that the term is 2 weeks. Okay, then this is where we're going to stop here because this is mamish the end of the sugya. And tomorrow is what? Is Wednesday? So it's still okay for 9:30? And then Thursday noontime. Okay, then. Have a great day.